Chapter 4. A good many hours after Salisbury had returned to the company of the Green Rep chairs, Dyson still sat at his desk, itself a Japanese romance, smoking many pipes and meditating over his friend's story. The bizarre quality of the inscription, which had annoyed Salisbury, was to him an attraction, and now and again he took it up and scanned thoughtfully what he had written, especially the quaint jingle at the end. It was a token, a symbol, he decided, and not a cipher, and the woman who had flung it away was, in all probability, entirely ignorant of its meaning. She was but the agent of the Sam she had abused and discarded, and he too was again an agent of someone unknown, possibly of the individual styled Q, who had been forced to visit his French friends. But what to make of traverse handle S? Here was the root and source of the enigma, and not all the tobacco of Virginia seemed likely to suggest any clue here. It seemed almost hopeless, but Dyson regarded himself as the Wellington of mysteries, and went to bed feeling assured that sooner or later he would hit upon the right track. For the next few days he was deeply engaged in his literary labors which were a profound mystery even to the most intimate of his friends, who searched the railway bookstalls in vain for the result of so many hours spent at the Japanese bureau in company with strong tobacco and black tea. On this occasion Dyson confined himself to his room for 4 days, and it was with genuine relief that he laid down his pen and went out into the lighted streets in quest of relaxation and fresh air. The gas lamps were being lighted, and the 5th edition of the evening papers was being howled through the streets, and Dyson, feeling that he wanted quiet, turned away from the clamorous Strand and began to trend away to the northwest. Soon he found himself in streets that echoed to his footsteps, and crossing a broad new thoroughfare and verging still to the west, Dyson discovered that he had penetrated to the depths of Soho. Here again was life, rare vintages of France and Italy, at prices which seemed contemptibly small, allured the passer-by. Here were cheeses, fast and rich, here olive oil, and here a grove of Rabelaisian sausages, while in a neighboring shop the whole press of Paris appeared to be on sale. In the middle of the roadway, a strange miscellany of nations sauntered to and fro, for the cab and hansom rarely ventured, and from window over window the inhabitants looked forth in pleased contemplation of the scene. Dyson made his way slowly along, mingling with the crowd on the cobblestones, listening for the queer babble of French and German and Italian and English, glancing now and again at the shop windows with their leveled batteries of bottles, and had almost gained the end of the street when his attention was arrested by a small shop at the corner, a vivid contrast to its neighbors. It was the typical shop of the poor quarter, a shop entirely English. Here were vended tobacco and sweets, cheap pipes of clay and cherry wood, penny exercise books and pen holders jostled for precedence with comic songs, and story papers with appalling cuts showed that romance claimed its place beside the actualities of the evening paper, the bills of which fluttered at the doorway. Dyson glanced up at the name above the door, and stood by the kennel, trembling, for a sharp pang, the pang of one who has made a discovery, had for a moment left him incapable of motion. The name over the little shop was Travers. Dyson looked up again, this time at the corner of the wall, above the lamp-post, and read in white letters on a blue ground the words Handel Street, W.C., and the legend was repeated in fainter letters just below. He gave a little sigh of satisfaction, and without more ado walked boldly into the shop, and stared full in the face the fat man who was sitting behind the counter. The fellow rose to his feet and returned the stare a little curiously, and then began in stereotyped phrase, "What can I do for you, sir?" Dyson enjoyed the situation and a dawning perplexity on the man's face. He propped his stick carefully against the counter, and leaning over it, said slowly and impressively, "Once around the grass, and twice around the lass, and thrice around the maple tree." Dyson had calculated on his words producing an effect, and he was not disappointed. The vendor of miscellanies gasped, open-mouthed like a fish, and steadied himself against the counter. When he spoke after a short interval, it was in a hoarse mutter, tremulous and unsteady. "Would you mind saying that again, sir? I didn't quite catch it." "My good man, I shall most certainly do nothing of the kind. You heard what I said perfectly well. You have got a clock in your shop, I see. An admirable timekeeper, I have no doubt. Well, I give you a minute by your own clock." The man looked about him in perplexed indecision, and Dyson felt that it was time to be bold. "Look here, Travers, the time is nearly up. You have heard of Q, I think. Remember, I hold your life in my hands. Now!" Dyson was shocked at the result of his own audacity. The man shrunk and shriveled in terror. The sweat poured down a face of ashy white, and he held up his hands before him. "Mr. Davies! Mr. Davies! Don't say that! Don't, for heaven's sake! I didn't know you at first. I didn't indeed. Good God! Mr. Davies, you wouldn't ruin me. I'll get it in a moment." "You had better not lose any more time." The man slunk piteously out of his shop and went into a back parlor. Dyson heard his trembling fingers fumbling with a bunch of keys and the creak of an opening box. He came back presently with a small package neatly tied up in brown paper in his hands, and still, full of terror, handed it to Dyson. "I'm glad to be rid of it," he said. "I'll take no more jobs of this sort." Dyson took the parcel and his stick and walked out of the shop with a nod, turning round as he passed the door. Travers had sunk into his seat, his face still white with terror, with one hand over his eyes, and Dyson speculated a good deal as he walked rapidly away as to what queer chords those could be on which he had played so roughly. He hailed the first hansom he could see and drove home, and when he had lit his hanging lamp and laid his parcel on the table, he paused for a moment, wondering on what strange thing the lamplight would soon shine. He locked his door and cut the strings and unfolded the paper layer after layer, and came at last to a small wooden box, simply but solidly made. There was no lock, and Dyson had simply to raise the lid, and as he did so, he drew a long breath and started back. The lamp seemed to glimmer feebly like a single candle, but the whole room blazed with light, and not with light alone, but with 1,000 colors, with all the glories of some painted window, and upon the walls of his room and on the familiar furniture the glow flamed back and seemed to flow again to its source, the little wooden box. For there upon a bed of soft wool lay the most splendid jewel, a jewel such as Dyson had never dreamed of, and within it shone the blue of far skies, and the green of the sea by the shore, and the red of the ruby and deep violet rays, and in the middle of it all seemed a flame as if a fountain of fire rose up and fell and rose again with sparks like stars for drops. Dyson gave a long deep sigh and dropped into his chair and put his hands over his eyes to think. The jewel was like an opal, but from a long experience of the shop windows he knew there was no such thing as an opal 1/4 or 1/8 of its size. He looked at the stone again with the feeling that was almost awe, and placed it gently on the table under the lamp, and watched the wonderful flame that shone and sparkled in its center, and then turned to the box, curious to know whether it might contain other marvels. He lifted the bed of wool on which the opal had reclined, and saw beneath no more jewels but a little old pocket-book, worn and shabby with use. Dyson opened it at the first leaf, and dropped the book again, appalled. He had read the name of the owner, neatly written in blue ink, Stephen Black, M.D., Oranmore, Devon Road, Harleston. It was several minutes before Dyson could bring himself to open the book a second time. He remembered the wretched exile in his garret, and his strange talk, and the memory too of the face he had seen at the window, and of what the specialist had said, surged up in his mind, and as he held his finger on the cover, he shivered, dreading what might be written within. When at last he held it in his hand and turned the pages, he found that the first 2 leaves were blank, but the third was covered with clear, minute writing, and Dyson began to read with the light of the opal flaming in his eyes.